Good evening and a very welcome to tonight's event. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, I'd just like to ask you to ensure that your mobile phones are switched to silent, and in the case of emergency, would you please follow the directions provided from the venue staff. It was to be my great pleasure to introduce Yvonne Weldon, AM, who's the Deputy Chair of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council and a City of Sydney councillor, to give a welcome to country. But unfortunately, she sends her best wishes and was unexpectedly unable to attend this evening. So on behalf of all of those present, I acknowledge that the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Gamaragal people of the Eora Nation, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I pay respects to elders past and present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here this evening. Tonight we are here on Gamaragal land for a purposeful discussion. I'd just like to acknowledge my fellow councillors here this evening, Councillor Mary Ann Berrigy, Councillor Georgia Lamb, Deputy Mayor Godfrey Santa and Councillor Shannon Welsh, and a number of council staff, including Council's General Manager Therese Manns. From Mossman Council we have Mayor Carolyn Corrigan and Councillor Pip Friedrich. From Willoughby Council, Councillor Georgie Rusak and Deputy Mayor Robert Samuel. And I'm pleased from the Aboriginal Heritage Office, David Watts, Phil Hunt and Kyle Nettleton are here, as well as the student leadership teams from Redlands School and Shaw School. I am sure that you all don't need reminding of the importance of maintaining respect for one another's views and opinions throughout the discussion this evening. So on the 21st of February 2022, at one of the very first meetings of this council wholeheartedly endorsed and supported the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It is inherent that by accepting this statement, we recognise the need for change and progress. As an organisation, this council is committed to providing an opportunity for our community to gather information about the upcoming referendum. This referendum is a personal decision for each citizen, and it's crucial that we respect the diversity of perspectives within our community. The purpose of tonight's event is to offer context and information about the question being asked of all Australians. It's about being informed by the facts. Let's delve into the heart of that question and understand what it entails. On the 23rd of March this year, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced the question Australians will be asked in the referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament.
This moment has been a very long time in the making, yet they have shown such patience and optimism through this process. And that spirit of cooperation and thoughtful, respectful dialogue has been so important at arriving at this point in such a united fashion. The question that Australians will be asked at this year's referendum is a very simple one. It will read, a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? That's the question before the Australian people. Nothing more, but nothing less.
So I think it bears repeating. The question is a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? Tonight we will hear from Thomas Mayo and Kerry O'Brien, and they will provide further insights into that question. But we also want to hear from you and your questions. So start thinking about them and submitting your questions by the QR code on, I've gone back. I shouldn't be in charge of technology. Using the QR code on the screen. This QR code will be displayed again later in the evening. It is very simple to submit your question with no need to download an app. Just scan the QR code and then follow the prompts. If you are having... Thank you. If you're having any trouble, I suggest you ask your neighbour. Someone will help you. So now it is my great pleasure to invite our guest speakers to the stage, Thomas Mayo and Kerry O'Brien. Thomas is a Kara-Reg Aboriginal and Kalkagal Erubamle Torres Strait Islander man. He is the Assistant National Secretary of the Maritime Union of Australia. Thomas is a signatory of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and has been a leading advocate since its inception in May 2017. He is the chairperson... Oh, are you all right? He is the chairperson of the Northern Territory Indigenous Labour Network and a director of the Australians for Indigenous Constitutional Recognition Board. Thomas is the author of 6 books, with his latest, the book co-authored with Kerry O'Brien, The Voice to Parliament Handbook. We are absolutely delighted that Thomas can join us this evening. Could you please welcome Thomas? Kerry O'Brien is one of Australia's most distinguished and respected journalists, with 6 Walkley Awards for Excellence in Journalism, including the Gold Walkley and the Walkley for Outstanding Leadership. Other industry awards include a Logie for public affairs coverage. Kerry has been a journalist for 49 years, covering print, television, wire services, as a reporter, a feature writer, a columnist and foreign correspondent. For ABC TV, he was the editor, presenter and interviewer for the 7:30 Report for over 15 years, the presenter and interviewer at Four Corners for 5 years, and at Lateline for 6 years. Kerry is the co-author of the Voice to Parliament Handbook, and we are delighted that he can join us this evening. If you would please welcome Kerry. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the stage over to Thomas to get us going. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming tonight to listen to this very important information about the opportunity that we're all going to have later this year. I'll just move through this briefly, but I think it's just important to have an understanding of the history of behind this here, the Uluru Statement. I might stand just for this, yeah? So this is the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I hope you're all familiar with it, but it's one of many statements and petitions through a long history of struggle to gain respect and to be recognised as the first peoples of this country. And I'll go through some of those just to show you a pattern throughout history. And all of these things are lessons that we learn that inform why we have called for a constitutionally enshrined voice in the Uluru Statement. This petition here was a petition to the King in the 1930s. This one here is the Yirrkala Bark petitions. It was the Yolngu people seeking to protect country. A mine was going to be built on their country. It was and one of the sets of words in the Yirrkala Bark petitions was that we fear that we will suffer the same fate as the Larrakia tribes. And so they saw the Larrakia people, which is where Darwin was built, the city there, and they feared that the Larrakia people were wiped out. And so the federal parliament were moving to excise a massive portion of Yolngu land for this mine, and they feared that they would be wiped out as well. This one here is the Larrakia petition to the Queen. So the Larrakia people struggled and fought to survive. You can see their thumbprints there. It wasn't just Larrakia people, but Aboriginal people there on Larrakia land. And in common for these statements and petitions is all of them called for political representation. So in some form, they all called for a voice. Okay, this consistency of our people calling for a voice. And they also were all dismissed and ignored. This one here is the Barunga Statement, 1988. Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister at the time. I separated out because he travelled to Barunga. Barunga is a small Aboriginal community near Katherine in the Northern Territory. And the Barunga Statement again called for a voice or representation. And Bob Hawke promised to establish a voice. He also promised a national treaty, but he wasn't able to deliver. So that history there of calling for voices, I've covered that. We didn't wait for governments to establish these voices throughout history. We organised, as any large group of people will do, right? You organise representation so that you can speak coherently and in a genuinely united way. And so these ones at the top of the screen here, beginning with the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association in the 20s, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices, especially for that last one, they were all silenced by intimidation, tactics of intimidation, or ignorance. So the authorities had complete control over Indigenous people's lives. They could steal our children. They could direct us to work without pay. They could exile us from country and separate us from our families, decide who we could marry. All of those sorts of powers that were completely legal under state legislation were used to intimidate those leaders and silence those voices, or they were simply ignored. These last three were established by governments that were more benevolent. The National Aboriginal Consultative Committee, the National Aboriginal Conference, and the one that Hawke established as a result of our efforts, the Barunga Statement, and that was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. And the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission and those previous two, every time a government set up a voice, the next government would come along and take it away. Howard opposed the establishment of ATSIC as the opposition leader. When Hawke was the Prime Minister, he said it would be an Aboriginal parliament, a black parliament. It would have the right to veto and all these sorts of fear-mongering things. Of course, none of that happened. But he opposed it, and as soon as he won power in 1996, he went about destroying it. And the way he did that was he amplified its problems, and he didn't celebrate the good work that ATSIC was doing, and it was doing good work, as was actually proven by his own inquiry. He appointed two Conservatives and Aunty Jackie Huggins to do an inquiry into ATSIC. It recommended that ATSIC should continue. It was important. It needed some reform, like all organisations need from time to time, needed some reforms, but that advice was ignored and ATSIC was destroyed. And even Amanda Vanstone, the Minister at the time, said they were wrong to do that. Why? Because the gap widened. Every time that we have a voice, Indigenous people have representation, we're able to improve our lives. And when that voice is taken away, things get worse. The gap continues to widen even today. The latest Closing the Gap report is a very sorry state of affairs. And these lessons, that we need a voice, that a voice will be taken away one day if it's only legislated, inform us in the Uluru Statement as we negotiated around the country. We had dialogues around the country and came together in a culminating convention at Uluru that we need a voice and we must establish it in the Constitution so that it is guaranteed. So the Australian people say that Indigenous people should at least have a say about the decisions that are made about them, and that's how you get better results. That was the making of the Uluru Statement. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'd ask Kerry to provide a short statement, or a statement, no time limit.
He always goes heaps longer than me, so just settle in.
Thomas always hopes I'm going to prove him wrong, and I never have. Look, Thomas has given you a fairly, in a few short minutes of history, has given you a sense of the attempt by Indigenous people to be heard. I come from a white perspective as a journalist. Actually, it's over 50 years now, Zoe, unfortunately. And like almost all Australians of my generation and the generations that had come before me and even one or two generations after me, I grew up in silence, I grew up in ignorance of Indigenous history and of the true totality of colonial history. An anthropologist named Bill Stanner, who was probably the preeminent anthropologist of his era, in 1968 gave a very important series of lectures for the Boyer Lectures on the ABC, in which he talked about the Great Australian Silence. And it was about how non-Indigenous Australia had managed to almost totally erase the Indigenous presence in this country. He talked about a window that looked out on the Australian landscape that had been placed in such a way that a very big and important part of that landscape was missing. And my education as a journalist in regard to that forgotten history was rapid, and it was shocking. And it was when I first went to Alice Springs on a totally unrelated story in 1970 for a Sydney newspaper, and was absolutely shocked to my core by what I saw, which was the most confronting exposure of racism that you could imagine. And I might add, when Thomas is talking about how Indigenous people were marginalised on reserves and so on, in Queensland, the particular form of marginalising and of controlling Indigenous lives became a part of the model for apartheid. So in my lifetime, with the exception of the Holocaust, the system of apartheid, of formally dividing a nation, a country, on I'll say ethnic grounds rather than racial grounds, because as far as I'm concerned, there is only one race. We are all one race of people. We might have different customs within different groups and within different nations and so on, but we are all one race. But the vast majority of the people in South Africa, I think it was something like over 20 million out of 26 or 28 million people, were black South Africans. And it was purely on the basis of their colour that they were marginalised in that way. And that model of apartheid, that abhorrent model of apartheid, was very substantially drawn from the Queensland model in the treatment of Indigenous Australians. So I have, in the decades since, down the decades since, I've reported on all of the big milestone moments, the good and the bad, in relation to Australia's formal relationship with its Indigenous population. I learnt so much more from our modern historians about the massacres. There have now been at least 500 massacres that have been documented beyond argument, despite the attempts in the 80s and into the 90s, the so-called culture wars, to silence, muzzle, discredit those historians. Now, why do people want to suppress this information? What is it that we fear about the truth? Surely we are more complete as a people and as a nation if we all have a very clear understanding of the truth of our history, good and bad, and everything in between, as we hopefully continue to improve as a civil society and as a democracy. And the voice in this referendum and the Uluru Statement, to me, represent a defining moment for this country, a defining moment for us all. And we'll talk tonight about why that is. And I'd rather, to be honest, just respond to questions, and through the questions to whether you've come here tonight very clearly of the view that you're voting yes, but you want to know more information, you feel you need to understand it better so you can explain to others when they ask you why you're voting yes. Or you may be genuinely sort of on the cusp, you're not sure, maybe you thought you were going to vote yes and you've read some of the stuff that's coming out of the no campaign and you're now a bit uncertain. Either way, we want to deal in the truth. We want to deal in the accurate analysis because we have nothing to fear about this. To me, the no campaign is a combination of mistruths and intellectual bankruptcy. Even where there are legitimate questions to be asked, the answers that they would have you believe are distortions. So in the end, you make up your own mind. I mean, yes, we're a democracy. Yes, we have free speech. Yes, we have the right to make up our own minds. I just wish that this debate could be conducted in a civil manner based on the facts. Yeah. So let's try and take that a little bit further over the course of the night.
Thank you. So we will start that point now, but I'll just remind you that that is the QR code and there are plenty of questions, and keep them coming. Thank you. So this is a question for both of you that is being asked in a variety of ways. Why do we need a change in the Constitution in order to have a voice? And a sort of subset of that question is, how do we respond to people when they say there are lots of different cultural groups in Australia? Why only give Aboriginal people a voice to the Parliament? Do you want to start, Thomas?
Yes, so we cannot ignore the lessons from our past. We could not ignore that as Indigenous people when we came together at Uluru, that our voices have always been silenced. And so the reason why we need to go to a referendum is because that's the only way that we change the Constitution, and the Constitution is the only place where we can guarantee through the cycles of elections and different parties winning power that this will continue. Okay? And I just want to say something that I didn't talk about earlier. It's also important to remember that this is the form of recognition that Indigenous people ourselves have asked Australians to accept. What we decided at Uluru is how we wanted to be recognised in the Constitution. And we decided that we wanted to be recognised in a practical way. Not just symbolism, but in a way that gives us greater fairness. And so this is why we're going to the Australian people to change the Constitution to recognise Indigenous people with a voice.
I'll pick up on Thomas, and then subsequently I'll answer about the other cultural groups. The fact that if you just look at the statistics, the stark statistics that tell the story of the place of Indigenous people in this society's social fabric in a country of enormous privilege, and what emerges is a picture of the most marginalised group in our society. And there have been attempts after attempts after attempts from government after government to close these gaps of inequality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on the most basic foundations of a decent civil society: health, education, housing, jobs. And then you can tack other things around that, infrastructure and so on. And those gaps are widening. When Kevin Rudd stood up in the Parliament in February 2008 and issued an apology on behalf of the nation to the stolen generations and the stories of how those children had come to be stolen over a 70 or 80 year span, going right up to about 1970, which was about forcefully processing a policy of assimilation to essentially breed Indigenous people white. Now, that is a very crude way of putting it, and believe me, in the official documents of government, state and federal, it's put even more crudely than that. And the assumption was that it might be possible to lift some of these Indigenous people up to, quote unquote, our standards. But the other part of the assumption, and that they possibly could be trained to be servants, domestic servants, or do menial labouring jobs. But for the rest of Indigenous Australia, the assumption was that they would die out. And in putting them on reserves and missions and so on, this was seen under this quaint term of smoothing the dying pillow. So in trying to turn around these inequities, from the moment of that apology by Kevin Rudd, the government committed to doing an annual measure of the progress by government in closing the gaps. And so what do we find now? That the vast majority of those measures across something like 19 categories, I think it's only 4 or 5 have made progress. Some have gone forward and then gone back. So areas like infant mortality, adult mortality, standard health measures, standard education measures like literacy and numeracy, and so many more of these categories. The fact is, despite all the many billions of dollars that have been spent, often by well-meaning policymakers in the bureaucracy and politicians, the fact is, substantially, those policies have failed. There have been some successes. Of course there have been some successes. And in the book we give just a few basic examples, of which there are many more, that demonstrate what happens when policymakers listen to Indigenous advice, get the reflection of Indigenous knowledge and tradition and culture. Indigenous people living in some of these marginal communities, they know what works, they know what's needed and what's not. They know when a policy is going to fail as it comes down the pipeline. Marcia Langton talked in evidence to the Parliamentary Joint Committee, which was considering the wording for this referendum. Thomas and I sat there listening as Marcia and others were giving evidence. She talked about the 10,000 people that she and Tom Calma consulted in 110 different Indigenous communities around Australia after the Uluru Statement came out, and they were looking at possible models. And she said that in community after community, they talked about the fly-in, fly-out bureaucrats who would come in with their notebooks and take copious notes and make promises. They'd go away, and they'd never be heard of again. Either there'd be no policy emanate from that, or the policy that came down had absolutely no reflection on their advice, and it failed. So for those people who are arguing that there's no need for this to be enshrined in the Constitution, they're basically saying the status quo is all right for us to stick with. Well, really? Is it? Is this something we can live with as human beings who want to feel some pride in our nation? So we're being offered a choice of a generous invitation by Indigenous Australians who, after long consultations around the country, came up with this extraordinary document, one of the most eloquent formal documents I think there is in our history. I can't immediately think of one more eloquent, more expressive, and more generous. But let me come to this other business of, are we creating a circumstance where we're giving special privilege to Indigenous people? Well, really, we wouldn't want to do that. As a friend of mine recounted a conversation with several friends, and they were going on about how Indigenous people get so many privileges. They get this, they get that, they get... And after about 10 minutes of this, he said, you know, gee, I wish I was born Indigenous. Now, you know, it can sound flippant, but it wasn't, and it stopped them in their tracks. Absolutely stopped them in their tracks. That stuff is specious and shallow and indefensible. But so the fact is, this country is today made up of many, many, many different ethnic groups from many nations around the world. And we are the richer for it. Absolutely no doubt about that. But the only group in this country that can offer this kind of that goes back to our origins is Indigenous Australians. 65,000 plus years of continuous civilisation, the longest continuous civilisation in the world, virtually the only thing that makes us unique and different as a nation from others. So if there were other groups that could make the case that this group does, you'd say, well, maybe there's a point, but I can't see one. The rest of us have a similar story. My family stock came from convicts, came from refugees, and it came from people who came here as free people from other countries. And that is true for all of us. We are everything from 7th generation to 1st generation. There is only one group amongst us that can lay claim to a history in this country like no other. And yet it is the most marginalised group in the country at the same time. So I just don't think, I think it's a valid point to raise, absolutely. But what is the risk here? There isn't one. We're not setting up a difference of privilege where we're elevating one group of people ahead of others. We are saying that we want to formally recognise the right of the first people of this country to actually be able to make representations to government and to the parliament. Not to veto things, not to issue instructions on policy, not to say what policy will happen or won't happen, merely to make representations. The government does not have to take up any single element of the advice that's offered. But what this constitutional amendment would do, with the weight of the Australian people behind it, would give that voice not only a permanence, but it would give it a moral and a political authority and a strength in its arguments that would make it difficult for any government to ignore it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I did get a balanced say in the book. Yeah, I got a word in the book at least.
Suzanne has asked, and it's representative of a series of questions, given that Indigenous people's life expectancy is around 8 years less than non-Indigenous people's, how do you Given that Indigenous people's life expectancy is around 8 years less than non-Indigenous people's, how do you think the voice will make a difference? And that's echoed in what practical difference will the voice make?
Yes, so there's housing affects health, affects education, infrastructure affects all those things as well. You have all of these areas that the voice can influence. And it can, take a holistic approach to policies and laws to improve our lives. I think one of the best examples of how a voice will make a practical impact on health is COVID. During the COVID, the pandemic, Indigenous peoples had a rare opportunity to shape how the response would happen in those communities. Communities that have great vulnerability because of the housing issues and all the rest. And because Indigenous people had some control over how they would handle the pandemic, the outcome was that there was six times less the infection rate for the broader Australian public, and not one person died in those communities. And so you can just see the effectiveness of Indigenous people having a say about what happens in communities. This was a great thing, but the problem is that it's inconsistent right now. And so you can get actually a good policy or a good program that is improving the health of Indigenous Australians, or the education, or in other things, but just like voices are taken away by the next government, it's chopped and changed every time there is a change of who has power in government. I was listening to a podcast, one of our co-authors in the book, Fiona Stanley, Dr. Fiona Stanley, her and Marcia Langton wrote a short chapter with a whole lot of practical examples. And Fiona mentioned in this podcast, I think it was just yesterday, her and Donna Archie, who is a leader in health organisations in Central Australia. She mentioned how there was around 70 Indigenous-controlled early childhood centres in communities around the country, all around the country, and that they were seeing, great results for that program. And the Abbott government came along and just got rid of it. Just chopped it. Not for any good reason, just for a very disconnected sort of political decision to just end these great programs that were happening around the country. Just another one, sort of in the way that a voice could defend good policies. In 2015, it was Abbott again. Hundreds of millions of dollars were cut from community services. A lot of children have FASD because of the loss of hope, because of all of those things that lead to alcoholism, right? And so when those services were cut in 2015, that had great effect on those families that needed those services, those youth, those babies that needed those services. And you hear in the media about the youth crime in Alice Springs, right? And if you really think about it, if you look back to when those services were cut and what that meant to those babies or those families, before those babies were born and they needed those services, there are serious repercussions down the track, not just for those Indigenous peoples and those families, but also for the broader community, right? And so this is the sort of thing where a voice can really help to promote good policies, promote good programs, and call out wasteful ones, and shape policy and program from their inception.
Which might, in the end, see the obliteration of fetal alcohol syndrome. I mean, so many of these problems are created out of poor policy in the first place, and what they're doing is exacerbating the problem. They're not just not fixing the problem. In many instances, they are exacerbating the problem. And how can you expect a community to function well if it has had generations of suppression, generations where hope has been lost, generations where, to me, education is the key to everything, is it not? Absolutely the key to everything, including the key to tackling prejudice. But if you don't have reasonable education, if you don't have all of these elements, all of the ducks in a row, you might say, then you're just going to perpetuate the problems and make them worse. And then when we see the pictures reported by a media that doesn't always necessarily go to the core of problems, it just reports the problems or the symptoms, as we saw mostly out of Alice Springs just recently. I mean, this is a choice between it's a combination of a symbolic statement and a symbolic step, which is the recognition, and of a very practical process through one institution having permanence in our democratic fabric. The power resides with the Parliament, but the wisdom in this case would come from communities.
Thank you. There's a series of questions anonymously that say, why the voice and not truth-telling and treaty first? Another question along similar lines is, some Indigenous people are saying they will vote no because a voice is not as important as a treaty. Can you explain why they are wrong? Yeah, I can. I mean, it's okay to have different opinions. We're like any other group of human beings. We're not homogenous. And we have our different experiences and perspectives, that shape us. And so that's completely normal. But firstly, on not all Indigenous people supporting this, and yes, some Indigenous people have been saying they believe a treaty should come first. Most Indigenous people support this, and we know this in a couple of ways. There was the process of dialogues that was a unique opportunity, well-resourced, well-formulated, Indigenous-led,
all around the country, covering the entire continent and adjacent islands, region by region. And when we brought those lessons from the past together, when we had informed debate and discussion that culminated in that convention in the heart of the nation at Uluru, we proposed a constitutionally enshrined voice, and that process in itself tells you that that this is something that is supported. Now, that is, I believe that if you ran that process again with 10 times as much resources and 10 times as many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people involved, we'd come up with the same outcome. We also know from polls, there's a number of polls that indicate over 80% of Indigenous people will be voting yes in this referendum. And some have said that that's a small poll, you know, that it's a small sample in that poll, but it's not. Around 800 people out of 800,000 is actually a considerable sample in polling, especially when you compare it to normal polling, you know, normal political polling. And so, you know, you've got those to understand that you're voting with Indigenous people, not for us. On the matter of treaty and this argument, I can explain why it's illogical. Firstly, because treaties are already underway in most states in the Northern Territory, and with bipartisanship. Queensland, a bill was passed and Kerry was involved in that. There's legislation now that really commences the treaty process, and it had Liberal support. In Tasmania, it's a Liberal state government, and they have entered into the treaty process there. And so to say treaty must come first ignores that actually they've already begun. And in Victoria, the treaty process has been going for around 10 years now. The other reason why it's illogical is because we have both Indigenous and non-Indigenous experts that say that treaty will likely to take 30 to 40 years to reach an outcome. 30 to 40 years. So I say this, why would we wait an uncertain amount of time for an uncertain set of outcomes before we set up a voice to be able to tackle better housing, better health, employment, education, and the list goes on? We should set up this voice now to start to take care of those issues. And so those are very good reasons why we should establish a voice without waiting for a treaty. I hope that explains it.
Thank you. There's a series of questions. There's a series of questions about what will the voice look like. Will it? Some of the questions are: will it look like a re-established ATSIC? I suppose that's the simple.
Well, ATSIC for a start was twofold. It was, if I've got this, if my memory is correct, I think it is, 35 regional bases. And so they had 35 regional councils, and those councillors were elected. They, in turn, elected 16 commissioners who were, if you like, at the top of the tree. They were the interface. The 16 commissioners were the interface between those regional councils and the national government. But there was also a service delivery function, which had quite a sizable number of people engaged in it. What is proposed here now is no service delivery, but that whether it is, according to the Langton-Calma model, a suggestion of 24 Indigenous representatives making up the voice, elected from communities right around Australia, but made up of 2 from each state. I think an extra one for the Torres Strait Islands, and 2 or 3 maybe extra positions for the more remote areas like the Northern Territory, for instance. Now, whether it ends up as 24 or whether it ends up as 30 or whatever, the principle that would apply is that form of representation would bring together, and the likelihood is that there would also be local and regional voices that would feed into the national voice, so that if you have a policy that may be multifaceted, that Model A might suit regional Indigenous communities, Model B might be more suited for remote communities. In other words, you would be building in elements that give genuine voice to a range of different communities with different variations of the problem or even different problems. And with the possible exception of ATSIC, I would think that would be the first time that you might expect, well, ATSIC would have done that to a degree, but we know what happened to ATSIC, which brings us straight back to why this needs to be permanently enshrined.
Can I just add to why what we're actually voting on here again is the principle, right? Should Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people be recognised with a voice to make representations on matters that relate to them? That's what we're voting yes or no to, okay? The model, which is what Kerry was talking about, is decided by the Parliament afterwards, okay? Because those sorts of details don't go into the Constitution because they would be rigid then. You know, you'd need another referendum to evolve, you know, or to change that. And so these things need to be improved over time. We elect the Parliament to do that. We hold them to account to do a good job, okay? And so it's the Parliament's responsibility to decide that model with Indigenous people because we have a voice, and that will be improved over time. I'll go to, does this work? No? You should go back. Back? I'll just go to the actual, we might as well do this, mate, it's here. So this is the actual, these are the 92 words that will go into the Constitution should we vote yes. And you can see really clearly, and this should help you in your discussions around the place. This is in the book. It was the same day that we had to go to the printers that we finalised the negotiation on these words. So we're really lucky. But it's a new Chapter 9, Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples, Section 129, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. So this first preambular part is just the recognition. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Parliament shall, subject to the Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. So, in recognition of Indigenous people, there'll be a voice to make representations on matters that relate to us, and the Parliament decides the rest, right? Just guaranteeing a voice. I hope that helps.
And just quickly, Zoe, the people who don't know the Constitution, and I think that's most of us, who aren't familiar with the Constitution, might elevate it to a kind of sanctity that I'm not sure it quite deserves. It's about the size of your passport. And it is, as Thomas says, a set of guiding principles. The High Court was written into the Constitution, and as Murray Gleeson, the former Chief Justice of the High Court, pointed out in expressing his support for the whole concept of the voice being enshrined in the Constitution, as he pointed out, it took 2 years for the Parliament to determine what the High Court might look like. And they included the first Prime Minister of Australia on the High Court. Now, the High Court is a part of our justice system which is supposed to be completely separate from elected politicians, so that was ultimately taken care of, but that gives you a sense of the imperfect way that these things happen. I mean, tax law. So the Constitution gives the Commonwealth the right to enforce taxes. But as a law graduate pointed out to me recently, when she studied law, she had to get her head around 7 volumes of tax law. That's not going to be written into the Constitution. So it can sound complicated, but when you unpick it, it's simple. The Constitution sets the principles. The Parliament has the power to make the laws. And the court system is there as one of the bulwarks of democracy to ensure that the Parliament doesn't overstep its authority. This is what our whole democracy is based on. And that sort of fear that was raised, a furphy really, about how if Indigenous people were allowed to give advice to the executive, that is, to ministers of departments and to the cabinet government, as well as to the Parliament, that it would bring the government to it grinding to a halt, and it would clog up the High Court. Well, another former Chief Justice of the High Court, Robert French, said no, that won't happen. Another very highly respected former Justice of the High Court, Kenneth Haynes, said no, that won't happen. The preeminent constitutional law academics in this country said no, that's not going to happen. And one of the most respected barristers who spends his life in front of the High Court, and I'm going to forget his name.
Brett Walker.
Brett Walker. See how we operate? Brett Walker said the same again. And so when you don't entirely, and believe me, as a journalist, I had to learn this very quickly because we're not experts ourselves. What we're expert in, when we have to report on a complex issue that lands on our laps with a few hours to somehow sound erudite on and explain to your readers or your audience, we learn very quickly to single out who are the most credible experts in the field who can explain it to us. And then you back that up with some fast reading. But you learn over time to evaluate who to listen to and who not to listen to. And believe me, those people that I've named as experts in constitutional law in this country are the ones you listen to. And they say there is not a problem, and the Solicitor General of Australia, who is non-partisan, is chosen by the government of the day as a non-partisan legal expert in constitutional law in this country to give frank and fearless advice to the government of the day. The Solicitor General has said, and he was actually chosen by the previous Conservative government, he says that the voice to Parliament enshrined in the Constitution will enhance the Constitution and strengthen our democracy. Now, do we need to know any more than that as far as the legals are concerned? I don't think so.
Thank you. For all of those, there are a lot of questions here asking about what you can do and how you can best support the Yes case. Thomas is going to speak to that shortly. But before we go there are a class of questions that say, one, for example, is from Councillor Robert Samuel, who said, a minority of no voters have been publicly viciously angry. Do you have a view as to how to blunt the anger? There are some other questions around the disinformation that is the highlight of the current debate and how to address that.
Yeah, I'd say we should be respectful in this debate, even though others are angry. We can't sink to that level. We've got to have respectful discussions with everybody that we can. And, you know, I think you're not going to blunt the anger, right? There are some people that are always going to be angry. They don't even know why a lot of the time. And certainly, you know, when it comes to this. If you come across people that are disrespectful, if they're being racist or angry or harmful, move on. Don't spend your time listening to them. Don't look at their posts on social media. Block them if you need to, you know, or mute them. You've got all sorts of things available on social media to block them out. That's my advice. At
the same time, you know, Thomas and I, we've travelled around the country having talks like this, and we struck one where, in Lismore, where there were some angry Indigenous people. The anger they were expressing was reflecting what they would say were generations of broken promises. I mean, Indigenous people are not the only Australians who feel cynical about what our political process has become, and that was reflected in the last election in the way both major parties copped a hit to their primary vote for those in Conservative electorates who voted for teal independence, those in other electorates where Labor lost more seats to the Greens. So it's happening to both sides of what has been traditionally a two-party system in this country. I absolutely understand where that anger is coming from in terms of Indigenous Australians who have more reason to feel cynical and let down than the rest of us in the main. And so you can understand for those who are saying, A, this does not go far enough, or B, I just don't trust politicians anymore to deliver. Well, the bottom line is, this in the end, of course the politicians are going to deliver final outcomes, but this is not being written by politicians. This has come from, as Thomas has so clearly shown tonight, this has come from Indigenous Australians, and the invitation hasn't gone to Canberra, the invitation has come directly to us. They've asked for this referendum. Indigenous Australians have asked for this referendum. So there is no purer form of democracy available to us than to be able to be given a question, a straightforward question, and we get to vote yes or no. We don't have preferential voting. We don't get our votes diffused. It's a straightforward proposition, yes or no.
And there's no such thing as a progressive no. No such thing.
So before I hand back to Thomas, there's a sort of a great question here which sums up many questions that you've submitted. If you don't know, and it's from Bob, if you don't know, vote no. He says, this is a call to perpetuate ignorance. How can we promote an alternative slogan? If you don't know, find out. Perhaps if you address that, the sloganeering and that debate maybe, and how do you counter it?
If you don't know the Voice to Parliament handbook, all the details you need.
The other thing about if you don't know, vote no, is that featured in the Republican referendum. Practically everything that has emerged on the no side of this campaign is essentially reflecting the template of the no campaign on the Republic. Now, you can come to your own conclusions about what that says. It's like, to me, and I'm not saying this of all, but to me it reflects that a significant number of the people who are leading the no campaign have started from the proposition that they were going to oppose it and then set out to find reasons to persuade the rest of us to join them. They didn't take an honest look, and this is my own personal view. I don't believe they took an honest look at this and made it an intellectual pursuit and an honest pursuit to get the facts, to listen to Indigenous people, those people who have led this process and who have collected the desires of Indigenous people around the country. They haven't paid them even the most fundamental respect. And we saw how quickly some were saying, after the statement came out, this is going to be a third chamber of Parliament. That was a rubbish claim that was very quickly dismissed. And sadly, tragically for this country, the Prime Minister of the day, a very erudite and well-educated man, Malcolm Turnbull, joined the fray. That it was going to be a third chamber of Parliament, something he has since walked back from. But that was a moment where his leadership was required and it went missing. So I think sometimes if you feel you're a bit confused about the quality of an argument, you can't quite work out, you can't work your way through the noise. Sometimes it helps to actually look at the people who are making the noise on one side or the other. Look at the quality and the calibre and the credibility of the people who are making up the debate on both sides. Maybe that helps you.
Thank you. So on behalf of Council, I extend our deep gratitude to Thomas and Kerry for graciously giving your time to share your knowledge with us. I'd also like to thank you all for coming tonight and your respectful and very thoughtful participation in the discussion with your questions. I must thank Rachel Noble, who has worked tirelessly. She's my EA, but she's a council employee of who we're very grateful for. Without her, it would not have happened tonight. I'd like to thank Council's communications and events team, the IT team for your support, even if I let you down. Copies of Kerry's and Thomas's book, The Voice to Parliament Handbook, will be available for purchase after the event. They are here to sign the book. If you wish to have your book signed, please, we ask that you stay seated until the rest of the audience have left, as you'll then be invited forward for the book signing. But to conclude this evening, Thomas will offer additional information on how you can support and learn more about the Yes campaign. He will take us back to where it all started by reading the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is the vital starting point to contemplate when casting your vote in this referendum. So once again, thank you all for being here tonight. Thomas.
Thank you, Zoe. So, how can you help? One of the most common questions that we get, which is a good thing. We're getting close to being only 60 days from this referendum, potentially. There's not a date announced, but it could be the 14th of October. Okay, so we're not far off. So this is urgent now. Okay, and if you believe, if you support this after the information we've given you tonight, and if you're invigorated to get out there and help us, then please do. But the way that you can help are these things. Firstly, I want you to work systematically through a list of people that you can possibly influence. Give them a call, ask them to, to support this. You'll be surprised how many people will just need to hear it from someone that they trust and someone that they love, to say that I've looked into this, I understand that it's safe and that it's meaningful, I'm voting yes and I'd like you to vote yes too. So have the discussion with them, listen to them if you have time, okay? That'll help you to be able to find out what information you need to give them. You don't have to move them straight away, leave them some information to consider and reflect and then follow them up later. The book is a great resource to do that, but also the website for the campaign is yes23.com.au. On that website you can donate. We do need we need money to be able to run the big ad campaign that we need towards the end. And you can also volunteer on that website. So I would love it if you can volunteer. I've done train stations 3 mornings this week so far, and I can tell you the feeling on the ground is very different from what you see in the media and on social media. Okay? People are curious, some are unsure, some are confused, but I've never had a negative interaction on the street or doing the pamphleting. And so please become a volunteer and help us to grow this movement. As volunteers, you will be hooked into your local group. I'm pretty sure there's one that's very active here. I am certain of that. But I hope that you guys get so many volunteers here that then you can be mobilised into other areas where it's tougher, where we have less people convinced. So we really need boots on the ground and for you to take that step and be challenged in that way. So that's how you can help. Also visibility. Visibility is vital. Yes23 has a shop on that website. Please get the shirts, order badges, those sorts of things. And we need people to see yes, an ocean of yeses everywhere. Just like in the marriage equality campaign, we need yes everywhere. All right, so now I'll end the night with the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That a peoples possessed the land for 60 millennia and this sacred link should disappear from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alien from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish, they will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you all. The Council is really proud to have supported this tonight. For those of you who have bought a book and would like it to be signed, if you'd stay in your seats. And for those who are not, we will continue the conversation. Thank you.